Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story tonight, because have I got a fabulous story for you. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I knew coming back to the familiar seaside town on the Oregon coast, where I'd grown up as a little girl, would not be easy by any manner of means. But I couldn't spend the rest of my days running away from my past. A very sweet elderly lady called Gemma Jones, loved by all the nurses at the hospital where I worked, who was dying, had shown me this. Gemma Jones had been riddled with a great deal of regret, things that she wished she had done but failed to do, that kind of thing, like restoring her long-lost relationship with her estranged sister, as she had fallen out with her decades prior, over something so trivial and insignificant. But now on her deathbed, when Gemma had reached out to her sister in her last-ditched attempts to make peace with her, she had been rebuffed. Gemma had grabbed me with a veiny arthritic hand. She had looked me straight in the eyes, through a penetrating blue gaze, and said to me, "Don't die one day, my love, with any regrets. It's just not worth it. If someone has offended you, make absolutely sure you're not only going to forgive them, but mend the broken bridges before it's too late." I was too proud to reach out to my sister. Now I'm dying with a great deal of regret in my heart. My sister refuses to have anything to do with me, and honestly, I can't blame her. Gemma's poignant words long after her death had resonated with me and drilled through me like a jackhammer drill, and every day they seemed to ring in my ears like an annoying ringtone that would never shut up. I guess I knew I needed to fix up a few gaping holes from my past before I really did end up living or even dying in regret. I would go to bed every single night wishing with all my heart and soul that I had done things differently. But at the time I was driven by base instincts, and I guess a large part of me was running away from myself, as facing the demon of my truth was more than I could bear at the time. If the truth be told, more than anything else in the entire world, I wanted to have a relationship with my 7.5-year-old daughter Chloe, whom I don't doubt probably didn't know I existed. I hadn't seen her for over 7 years. Furthermore, my mother Claudia needed me more than at any other time in her life. Her mental decline would eventually become progressively worse and worse. Sadly, she'd been diagnosed with early onset dementia. I needed to be there for her, as she'd always been there for me when I needed her. So I was desirous to return the favour. Ostensibly, never once had my mother ever let me down. I needed to go back home, honour her in the way that she had always honoured me. I had also decided to return home for another very good reason, which concerned my ex-husband Richard. I was struggling to find out how I should approach this matter with as much sensitivity as possible. The matter concerned my daughter Chloe, most obviously, who had been on my mind every day since I'd left my beloved hometown. My brother Andrew had lived at home diligently for over 10 years, with his wife Amelia and their little boy Jack, who'd been born a year later. My brother moved his family into our childhood home, Golden Sands, to be with my mother, as he had noticed that she was not doing great on her own, with her extreme forgetfulness crippling her life. He had worried incessantly that she might leave the gas on one night and bring the entire house down in flames, and so he had felt it imperative to move in with my mother during such a vulnerable time in her life, when it was so obviously clear that she couldn't manage on her own. My brother was now restless for change. He wanted a complete change of scene. Even though my mother didn't want him to leave, she had grown desperately fond of Andrew's family living at Golden Sands with her, where she could be close to her beloved grandchild Jack. Yet she was still the first to appreciate and acknowledge that he couldn't remain at her home indefinitely. She understood that. Andrew and his wife and little Jack needed some space to be on their own together as a family. Now my brother was moving to California for a job opportunity that he would be a fool to turn down, as the money and exciting challenges the job offered were very promising indeed, and besides anything else, he deserved a brand new start for his young family. Andrew first became worried about my mother's increasing absent-mindedness and congenital decline. Over 10 years ago, it had worried him significantly, which was why he had promptly moved into Golden Sands. It would seem my mother's current diagnosis of early onset dementia had not come as a surprise to him at all. My mother had been found one night 10 years ago, wandering around on the beach in the late hours of the evening, looking disorientated and very confused, almost as if she was drunk or inebriated. She didn't know who she was, or what she was doing, or how she came to be on the beach, which had been a great source of concern for me and my brother. Golden Sands, like many properties on our side of the street, overlooked spectacular oceanfront views, and were all only a short walk away from the beach. We were both completely baffled as to why my mother had no memory of going out onto the beach in the middle of the night like that. By all accounts, high tide would have been at 1:33 in the morning, and if she'd been out and about then, she could have got herself into all kinds of trouble. The thought had filled my brother with dread. I know my brother would never have forgiven himself if anything bad had happened to my mother, as after my dad died, he considered himself man of the household. It was at about 11:30 at night when my mother was observed running around on the beach in circles, rather like a dog chasing its own tail, and never quite been able to catch it. It was a local man by the name of Pearson Galloway that had thankfully spotted my mother behaving strangely that night on the beach. He had described her as almost being in a trance-like state. At first he thought she might be tipsy or bladdered, after having drunk too much. Then he realized she didn't appear to be all there, almost as if she was caught up in her own illusory world. It shocked him to realize my mother appeared to be stone-cold sober, but behaving in an outlandish way that was nothing short of peculiar. My mother kept dipping her feet into the icy waves when they rolled towards the shoreline. Pearson had called out to her several times, because he knew my mother well. "Claudia! Claudia! Claudia, are you all right?" But his frantic urgency to get her attention was met with a great deal of giggling, as if my mother found everything terribly amusing. My mother looked straight through him like a translucent pane of glass, as if he wasn't even there. He said the experience had given him the chills. She was like one of those robotic toys, running around and around in circles on the beach sand, giggling all the time. She appeared to be disconnected to her reality, he told us. Pearson Galloway had a reputation of being a raging insomniac. He battled to get to sleep every night, so it wasn't desperately uncommon for him to take a stroll down the beach in the middle of the night, if the tide was low. So thankfully he had been the one to rescue my mother, to bring her safely back home. I will never forget that night when my mother arrived back at Golden Sands, looking like a half-drowned kitten. She was shivering from cold because she was soaking wet, and giggling so much, as if she found everything so very funny. We never did find out what she was laughing at. We did succeed in shaking her out of her daze, and when she came around from her delirium, she was shocked to learn that she'd been found wandering around aimlessly on the beach, when she believed she was in bed at home, safely tucked away in her bed, which was definitely not the case. So what did happen to my mother that night? We'll never know the answer to that question. Some suggested that my mother might have been sleepwalking, but the sobering, fortuitous event was a source of great concern for me and Andrew, who were heartily relieved it hadn't happened again. My brother had joked that we might have to put a bell on my mother's toe to wake us up should she pull off that stunt again in the middle of the night. My mother wasn't remotely amused by this suggestion. I gather they used to perform this practice when burying dead people, in case they'd been accidentally buried alive, The bell would get people's attention so that the person could be rescued from their grave. When it came to my mother's condition, the tests from the doctor's office had been rather inconclusive, but I believe even back then these may have been early signs of dementia, although I dare say the experts would disagree with me on this. My mother Claudia had not been diagnosed with dementia until now, 10 long years later after that incident. It was Andrew who had encouraged me to return home, to take care of Mum in his place. As being a nurse by profession, it made a lot of sense to him that I should watch over our mother during this tumultuous time. Furthermore, he didn't know how long we had Mum in a reasonable, coherent condition like this, where she still knew who we were and could interact with us as she had always done. But invariably there would still be blips when she switched off like a computer that occasionally becomes faulty and needs to be reprogrammed. We knew there would come a time when me and Andrew would become strangers in my mother's life, and that did not bear thinking about. The thought of my mother not knowing who we were freaked me out, as it did Andrew, but we both knew well that this was a progression of the disease and would eventually be expected to happen. I was clued up about dementia after having worked in a hospital, but it's always incredibly different when the condition affects one of your own beloved family members, as then it's far too close to home for comfort. I certainly dreaded the day when my mother would look at me with a blank, vacuous stare that registered no recollection and said to me, "Who are you?" And I knew I had to prepare myself emotionally for such an eventuality, as it wasn't so much a question of if it would happen, but more a question of when. My mother always used to say growing up that one of her biggest fears in life would be losing her mind, and it seemed that her worst fear would be realized. Suffice to say, coming back home, I knew I had to prepare myself for all manner of confrontations that I would likely receive. And believe me, I'm the kind of person that hates confrontation of any kind. But most especially, I needed to be wary of my ex-husband Richard, who would not be remotely pleased to see me after what I did. I knew I would have to brave the storm of condemnation and judgments that would be flung my way indiscriminately, like hailstones blasting out of the sky, creating havoc wherever they fall. What my brother did not know was that I had been looking for the quintessential excuse to come home, as there were things I needed to do to correct some of the wrongs in my life, some of the gaping holes, so to speak, that had been growing ever bigger and bigger with every passing year, and were badly needing a good repair job. Furthermore, my brother Andrew was going to pay me to look after my mother, given he was earning good money, especially if he was to accept this great job opportunity in California. My brother had told me that he would so much rather pay me to nurse our mother than a random nurse who was emotionally disconnected to her. I was, by profession, a real nurse, so instead of working at the hospital, I would become my mother's full-time carer. It was a win-win situation, and I was more than qualified to take care of her. I was looking greatly forward to spending quality time with my mother before her mental health invariably declined. I wanted to enjoy what time my mother had left, while she still remained in her right mind. Regretfully, she did have fleeting episodes when her memory betrayed her, when she couldn't remember whether she'd eaten that day or not. On one occasion, she'd popped to the grocery store to buy peanut butter over 5 times in one day, repeating the journey over and over again. So sometimes her memory could be very vague, but as my brother would joke, at least there was no chance of us ever running out of peanut butter any time soon. And with a forgetful person around like my mother, you could easily prepare for Armageddon. "Aoife, I really need you to take care of Mum," Andrew had told me. "It's very important you come back home. Mum needs you. Besides, it will be good for you to spend quality time with her before she begins to steadily decline. I know she could do with your help around the house, with cleaning, cooking and shopping, and she will very much enjoy your company. She doesn't need a strange nurse or housekeeper taking over her life for her. She'd find that far too intrusive." "I'm not sure coming back home is a great idea, Andrew," I'd said, my stomach twisting itself into knots, my heart beginning to flap in my chest cavity like a flustered pigeon that had been startled by the family cat. Of course, I wanted to come back very much, and to help my mother. But did I have the courage to do it? I wasn't quite sure I did. I'd thought about returning home often enough, but I was still gripped with a vacillating hesitancy to do so, and a terrible fear of unsavoury confrontations that would make me cower like a frightened cat, hiding under the bed. My brother was silent for a brief moment, and then he said in a somewhat pleading tone of voice, "I need to accept this job, Aoife, as I'm sure you can appreciate. It's very important for me. I need to do this for Amelia and Jack. I won't be able to accept it if you don't come back home. One of us needs to be here for our mother. I've been with her for over 10 years now, Aoife, and I would stay longer, but this job offer is too irresistible to refuse, and I think that Amelia and Jack would very much appreciate a change of scene. I need this, Aoife. I really do." "Of course you need to take the job, Andrew. You can't possibly turn it down. That would be absolutely insane." "The last thing I want to do is to manipulate you, Aoife. But if the truth be told, I can't possibly accept the position in California unless you agree to move in with Mum. I think if I were to bring a stranger into her household, a care nurse perhaps, or someone like that, she would be very resistant to such an idea. You know what Mum's like. She's as stubborn as an old mule, and she doesn't do change awfully well. If you move in with her, things would be different. Mum would welcome you moving back in with her. She's in the early stages of her disease, so being around familiar faces will bring her considerable comfort, reassurance, and the feeling of stability that she craves. Mum has really missed you so much, Aoife. You have absolutely no idea about how much. She's talked about you incessantly. You've been away for far too long, and that's been insanely tough on her, because the two of you are very close. Besides anything else, Aoife, she's not ready to be taken to some kind of care home, is she? It's far too early for that to be considered. She's still in excellent shape, you know. And apart from anything else, don't you want to see Mum? Be around her while she's still got her marbles about her? Because that won't last for very long, you know. You've missed out so much being away for so long, Aoife. You've got a lot of making up to do." "Of course I want to come back home, Andrew. I've missed Mum so much. I've missed you. I've missed Golden Sands. That's not the problem, and you know it. It's the ghosts of the past that may come back to haunt me that I'm worried about. I don't know if I can deal with them. I'm not sure I'm tough enough, Andrew, for all that. I'm a bit of a wimp. Actually, I'm a very big one." "I appreciate, Aoife, it's not going to be easy coming back home for you. But you can't possibly stay away from home forever. You're not a coward, Aoife. Whatever you may say, you are no coward. I strongly dispute that. If people judge you, that's their problem, not yours. You did what you did at the time because you were in a very bad place. You reacted in a way that was fitting for you at the time. If some people have a problem with that, it's their cross to bear, not yours. If people around here haven't got anything better to do than gossip and snigger about you after you've been gone for 7 years, well, then I feel decidedly sorry for them. It only emphasizes to me what a pathetic, pitiful life they invariably have." "I don't think I can do it, Andrew. I really don't. 7 years is a long, long time. I'm afraid people have got long memories. What will they think of me if I suddenly rock up on the scene after such a long leave of absence? They'll be so quick to judge me, believe the very worst of me, because of what I did." "Aoife, let go of this, will you? For God's sake, girl, let it go. Don't you see you're punishing yourself? If I've learnt anything about this life, it is to stop caring what other people think, and not to give a damn about how they react to you. Yes, they will gossip about you when they learn you're back. Take it from me, they will. They certainly gossiped enough about you when you left town, and they said some pretty hurtful, spiteful things to me about you. They weren't true, of course,
You know what, Aoife? We ignored the trolls, and you must do the same. Stand up for yourself, for God's sake. Quit being a shrinking violet, why don't you?
I know you're right, Andrew. Everything you say makes perfect sense. But it's harder to put into practice, it really is.
Listen, Aoife, I'm in no doubt when some of the locals see you again, they'll give you a piece of their mind and tell you what a dreadful person they think you are. But I know the truth, and so do you. Don't let those trolls get you down. They will never understand what you went through back then. They don't have a clue.
It's true. They don't know the half of it.
Think about it, sis. If you look on social media, you'll see all manners of divided opinions that people have about various things that happen around the world. People can be divided. They can be ruthlessly judgmental. Some people will be kind, others downright cruel. It's the nature of the beast. Do you know what I've discovered, sis? Is that you cannot please all the people all of the time, no matter what you do in life. Let's not kid, Aoife. There are always going to be people who have ruffled feathers. Such people will always find fault, no matter what you do. They get a buzz out of being unkind, due to the fact that they're so damn miserable with their lot, that if they pull somebody else's life apart, it makes them feel a whole lot better about themselves.
You're right about that, Richard, I agreed.
You know what, Aoife? I remember reading somewhere that sometimes even the most first-class gourmet restaurants with squeaky clean reputations and Michelin stars to their names will get that one person that dines out at their restaurant that will find fault with their meal, even though it's as close to perfect as you can get. Such people cause a scene, make everything desperately unpleasant for everybody else. You're always going to find one wasp among the honeybees who doesn't belong and wants to cause chaos and discord. It's a way of life, sis. You need to take it in your stride. Everything is going to be all right in the end. I can promise you that. Besides, I'm sure you want to go and see Richard and talk to him. He's not so unreasonable, Aoife, as you might believe. I know you're longing to see little Chloe again, and that is never going to happen unless you take the bull by the horns.
I don't know, Andrew. I don't think that Richard has ever forgiven me for what I did. And I'm not sure he's going to be happy about me getting to see Chloe.
Well, he's going to have to get over it, isn't he? Said my brother sharply. He's not stupid. He must know you had your reasons for leaving town. He may not understand why you did it, but you need to get through to him that things weren't easy for you back then. You have your rights as a mother, Aoife, and he needs to appreciate that.
I know, but you yourself told me that Richard is living with another woman now. I'm not sure how she's going to react to my being in town again. She might see me as a threat.
Well, she's going to have to get used to it, isn't she? She knows that you have a daughter with Richard, and she's going to have to accept that whether she likes it or not.
Well, I suppose you're right, Andrew.
Of course I'm right, Aoife. When have I ever been wrong about anything? My brother teased.
I chuckled. One thing that hasn't changed, Andrew, is you're still pretty sure of yourself, aren't you? As cocky as ever, if you don't mind my saying so.
Of course I'm right, sis. That's why I'm sure as eggs that moving in with Mum on your part is a grand idea. You need to come home as soon as you possibly can, Aoife. Mum needs you, I need you, we all need you. And you need to heal some of those old festering wounds from the past. Running away from them is not going to fix them, is it? It's rather like abandoning an abscess in the gums that gets progressively worse, that only a trip to the dentist will ultimately fix. Coming back home is the root canal treatment you need to bring healing into your life, Aoife.
Well, when you put it like that so eloquently, Andrew, how can I refuse you? All right, I'll do it. I'll come back home. My brother seemed to be saying hallelujah down the phone, and I knew I couldn't backtrack now. I had promised I would return home, and I was not going to dishonour my word. My mother needed me, and I would be there for her, no matter what, even if it meant I had to put up with a lot of condemnation from some of my friends in town, whom I hadn't seen in over 7 years, whom I didn't doubt had a very bleak opinion of me by now. As far as I was concerned, it was a win-win situation to move in with Mother again,
It would be strange waking up in my own childhood bedroom after all these years, which my brother assured me had been kept the way I'd left it, when me and my husband Richard had been living with my mother, while we waited for our home to be built. At the time there had been all kinds of roadblocks that we had had to overcome. Richard was now living in the house we'd designed together, with his fiancée and our little girl Chloe. I had walked out on our marriage all those years ago, when our designer home had been completed. We had lived there for all but a week before Chloe had been born. So when we returned home, everything in our life had been perfect, until it was not. One day when Chloe was 6 months old, my mother had been taking care of her at Golden Sands to give me a break from my childcare responsibilities, as being a full-time mother was absolutely exhausting. But something dramatic had happened that day that had shredded my life apart into hundreds of pieces. I had left a note for Richard on our refrigerator to say that I couldn't go on this way, for when the brutal truth was fully realized, I knew I would not be able to look Chloe in the face again. I'm quite sure Richard didn't have a clue what the note meant, or what on earth I was talking about, but some secrets are best not shared, because they can leave a trail of devastation in their wake, like the chaos after a tsunami, and I couldn't do that to Richard. I knew I needed to get as far away from my hometown as possible. Without looking back, I moved to Florida. I'd been resolutely independent, living there in Pensacola, which is the westernmost city in the Florida Panhandle, in the county seat of Escambia, where I'd taken a job as a nurse at the Ascension Sacred Heart Hospital, and for a while I'd been very happy there, but I had always felt a deep yearning to return home. I regretfully missed several Christmases and Thanksgivings with my family, and those had been lonely times, when I'd longed to come back home, but my lack of courage had kept me away. I knew things were about to change exponentially for me in leaps and bounds. It would seem that no matter how long you've been away from home, there really is no place in the world quite like it. Golden Sands was one of many houses on the street, nestled on a hilly incline, that overlooked a pristine stretch of beach and the most glorious idyllic oceanfront views that I had appreciated so very much as a child. I had missed all that, being away from Golden Sands for so very long. Sometimes when I lay asleep in bed at night, after a busy shift spent at the hospital, I would see myself as a little girl again, running across the stretch of beach with a bucket and spade in my hand, and my little brother at my side. We would be happily, industriously making sandcastles together. My mother would elegantly be sitting there, stretched out on her beach towel, her head shaded by the umbrella of a wide-brimmed straw hat, wearing a pair of rather glamorous sunglasses. She would sit next to my father on the beach, who would also be stretched out on a beach towel. I think my dad would bring a book along with him. In my mind's eye he was so obscure in my recall, and the harder I tried to focus on memories of him, they would become increasingly more dim. My mother also brought a book along to the beach with her every time. She thoroughly enjoyed reading romantic fiction or detective novels. I always remember she wore bright red lipstick at all times. She would say Marilyn Monroe would never be seen dead without her signature red lipstick anointing her lips, and she was much the same. Sometimes she went to bed at night, wearing that bright shade of red lipstick. She would tease that if there was an emergency situation at the house, she still wanted to look her very best. I had little memory of my father, which was something I deeply regretted. By the time I was 7 years old, he died on a building site, where the scaffolding had unfortunately collapsed on top of him in a fortuitous, unforeseen accident, where my father had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, which is always the way with accidents. Regretfully, he'd been put into a medically induced coma after the accident, but his body could not overcome his traumatic brain injury. He never woke up from his coma, and my mother had been forced to allow the hospital to switch off life support. I still cannot imagine what that must have been like for my poor mother at the time. Me and my brother were too young and impressionable to fully appreciate what was happening with our father. One day my mother told me and Andrew that our dad would never be coming back home. "He's with the angels in heaven now," I remember being so angry that my dad had not taken me and Andrew along with him to be with the angels. It seemed like a raw deal to have been left behind like this. For years I'd look up at the heavenlies and wonder if my father was looking down on us. Sometimes I'd even wave at him. When I was older, my mother told me that my father had always known he would die young. He had intrinsically believed he'd never live past 30, and he was right about that. My mother had laughed at him and his faint imaginings, telling him to stop being so ridiculous, and that he'd probably outlive her. When he was a boy, he'd actually done a picture of a stairway to heaven, almost as if he anticipated his early demise, as if it was written in the stars for him. He had said to his own mother, "That's where I'm going when I leave this place," and his words had given my grandmother the chills. My mother had chosen to never marry again, but my father's life insurance policy saw us through any financial challenges that could have presented themselves to us along the way. Luckily, my dad had insisted on taking out all these policies, given his premonitions about an early death, which he didn't take lightly. And also because working on a building site, you make these kind of provisions for your family as a matter of routine, should the worst ultimately happen. The financial burdens over our family were thus lifted. The insurance payouts had carried us over the rocky turbulence of our lives. After my dad died, I don't think my mother was quite the same again. A spark inside her had gone out. She had absolutely no interest in dating other men. She told us that Dad was her soulmate, and replacing him was close to impossible, so she wouldn't even bother to try. I mean, what was the point? She'd rather be alone, she told us. I was glad to be coming home again, and to all the memories that coming home invariably engendered, like the crashing waves that come rolling onto the seashore, every second, reminding us that they are never going away. Besides anything else, I needed to be here for my mother. She had never once betrayed my trust when I'd run away from town with very good reason. I'm sure in town they thought I was a terrible person, but I really didn't care about that, or what other people thought of me. My brother was right about that. If we let people's opinions of us dictate our happiness, then happiness would become as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel. I had decided after speaking to my brother on that phone call that from now on I was going to stand up for myself and face my demons. After a while I was sure the mud would finally settle, and hopefully my return home would be like old news. Sooner or later I would have to face the music over what I'd done, but I'd felt braver and more courageous after listening to Andrew's words of encouragement than ever before. So there we are. That is the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.